Hey everybody, welcome to today's show. We are super happy to be joined by Nick Cook, who is an award-winning journalist. He is on the board for the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. He has written over 20 titles, directed 2 full-length feature films, and the topics that he has covered are simply fascinating. So we're very excited to have him here today, and thank you all for joining us at home. Sit back and relax, and we'll be right back with Quantum Ladder Podcast. Welcome back to Quantum Ladder Podcast. My name is Louis Borges. Joining me as always, my good friend and co-host, Marquise Williams.
What's up, guys? It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited about this interview. If you know where we come from, you know this is kind of like a salivating moment for this aspect of our investigation throughout our time on the internet. So I actually want to start off with a big question, but I'll wait and see how you gear us here first.
Yeah, this show is more science and technology based, but again, we do come from the world of extraterrestrials, looking at science. Could such a thing exist? Not getting too much in the lore and the myth of things, but trying to have a factual based mind on things to really get some answers and explain. And I've been fortunate enough, and you have as well, to interview some very high ranking people who know a lot of stuff. And Nick Cook is no exception to that. Nick has reported on things such as secret weapons, defense and security, 0-point energy, global challenges, the future of technology. So he's a fitting guest, and he works with some of the highest end people in this field as well. Brilliant guy, super nice guy, and we are very happy to have him join us today. So with that, warm welcome to our new friend, Mr. Nick Cook.
Hello from England.
Yeah, we are in 3 different time zones right now to make this happen. So thank you, everybody, for your commitment to this. And thank you, Nick. It's been a long time in the making, but persistence is key. And I finally got you to find a slot, and, we're doing this here. So we're super happy to have you. And for anybody that's maybe not familiar with you or your work, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what got you into the field of work that you're in now.
Well, thank you for, first of all, having me on the show. It's great for me to be here. Personally, worth the wait. So thank you for bearing with me because we had a little trouble getting this together. It's quite hard to define, even for me sometimes, what I am professionally. I'm a writer. I'm a storyteller, obviously. I was a journalist. I am a consultant. So I do technology consulting. I consult with companies on their sort of corporate storytelling, their corporate strategy. So I do lots of things, but I like it that way because maybe I have a sort of very low boredom threshold, but doing all of these things keeps me busy and it keeps me curious. And but probably first and foremost, I'm a storyteller. That's what I do.
My favorite thing of all time is storytelling, by the way. So that's awesome, And I did say I wanted to start this off with a big question. So please bear with me, Nick, on this one, because usually we don't do this. It's like turning the whole thing upside down. If people knew what you knew about everything else, how would they feel? How would they feel?
Well, that's a great question. I've not been asked it before, but my immediate response to that is I'm very cautious about what I think I know because I'm constantly updating myself, particularly on the subject of the phenomenon. I mean, by the phenomenon, I'm talking about UFOs and UAP, but I'm also talking about the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality itself. It is really unwise, in my opinion, to have fixed positions about any of those things, because I think the phenomenon itself is constantly changing, and it sort of it really doesn't like people to take fixed positions on it, because it'll do something really surprising to shake your position on those fixed positions if you do. So I'm not trying to be flip in answering your question, Marquise. I guess I have learned things, though, over the past maybe five years, certainly, which have been eye-opening to me. And actually, my own journey of sort of discovery, particularly about the phenomenon itself. And bear in mind, I'm a nuts and bolts guy. So I came from a tradition of really dyed-in-the-wool journalistic reporting. I reported, as you said in your introduction, on the world of aerospace, defense, technology, and weaponry. So, those are pretty solid things. And then, so to have come from that world into the world of consciousness, using the lens of consciousness to look at the UAP UFO phenomenon and learn things about that phenomenon, which have surprised me greatly. I mean, that's been a fantastic journey for me, and it's going on. So, what's the most surprising thing that I've learned along the way? I guess it is that non-human intelligence is a real thing. And, I do like, for all of my sort of hopefulness, trust, and faith in things out there, I do like to have some stakes in the ground still. And, when Congress came out, as it has over the last couple of years, to launch its own inquiry into UFOs and UAP and into the nature of non-human intelligence, that has given me a sort of real world certitude that it's not just me imagining things about this phenomenon. These things are real, because, not least because, they are in the minds now of politicians and lawmakers. And with my old journalistic hat on, I can go, okay, this now is a real thing, and we can all sit up and take notice of it. So, sorry, long-winded answer to your question, but that's kind of where I am.
I was fortunate enough about 2 years ago to interview George Knapp and Colin Kelleher about their book Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. And I considered myself a nuts and bolts guy. I was a science major in school. I didn't get too much into the sort of woo, as they call it in this field. I wanted to keep it fact-based. And I really respected George Knapp and the work he did with Bob Lazar and everything else. And as the interview progressed, he starts going into the world of like consciousness and the hitchhiker effect and Bigfoot and orbs and like everything. And he's going, hey, I used to be the most nuts and bolts guy there is. And now you got to look at all this stuff. And both him and Colin did experience hitchhiker effects. They had weird things happen after going to the ranch, and their minds were opened as a result of even investigating this type of thing. And a lot of people that they've spoken with had similar phenomenon. So what do you think it is about the phenomenon, and particularly the hitchhiker effect, that people that get into it or that visit haunted places or places with high strangeness, what do you think it is about that carries along with people outside of that environment?
Well, yeah, just to take that back a bit, as you said, Louis, you come from that nuts and bolts tech science tradition, which is what I come from. So when I first sat up and took notice of the phenomenon, really was in 2017. I mean, that's a pretty seminal date for a lot of people in this world, because it was in December 2017. That was when the New York Times did its seminal story about ATIP, this advanced aerospace technology integration program, is it? Or investigation program that the Pentagon's UFO investigation body, which had been in secret existence for some time, wow, okay, so despite its denials for decades, the Pentagon has an office which has been looking at UAP or UFOs. So that enables, and that is all confirmed too subsequently. So that enables me to sit up and go, okay, I can look at this now without the fear of that stigma which is attached to it, because I started asking around various people I knew, even people in aerospace and defense. They had noticed this same article. They similarly felt some of the shackles that had prevented them from speaking about it removed. So, bit by bit, people came out of the closet, if you like, who'd had an interest in all of this before, who began to look at it and go, okay, so then maybe there's something to this. I went from there to thinking, okay, so I come from a nuts and bolts tradition. I've done a bit of reading on UFOs. I hadn't done that much reading on them. But what I did know, because I'd done a book on the hard tech aspects of secret exotic aerospace development. The book was called The Hunt for Zero Point, and it came out in 2001 in the UK, 2002 in the US. And that was The Hunt for Zero Point was my own attempt to investigate a tiny, tiny portion of the UFO phenomenon, which was, I didn't even see it in those terms, by the way. I just saw myself as investigating a potentially highly secret aspect of aerospace and defense, which was a propulsion and energy breakthrough that would give you a kind of anti-gravity capability. I'd taken that investigation as far as I could possibly go. So in 2017, I'm thinking, well, what can I usefully contribute to an investigation into UFOs? I've done the nuts and bolts tech bit. So I thought, I think it's got to be related to consciousness. I'd read some books previously, a long time ago, actually, written by Jacques Vallée, and Vallée's position was or is that there is much more to this phenomenon than simply UAP or flying saucers, UFOs, call them what you will, penetrating our airspace. This emerged for Vallée out of a tradition that went back hundreds of years, which was associated with other phenomena like ghosts and, fairies and mythology and, mythical creatures. The way that perhaps we were seeing this modern phenomenon was just a twist on an old take or a different take on an old phenomenon. So I thought, to make a difference, I'm going to need to bone up on consciousness. But I knew absolutely nothing about it. This was in 2017, except for one thing, which was in 2014, I was at the bedside of my much loved dying mother-in-law and actually I was there at the moment she died, and my wife was holding her hand. Mm-hmm. And in the moment that she passed, in the moment my mother-in-law died, my wife, who was holding her hand, suddenly stood up and went, "All is well." And I'm thinking very quietly to myself, obviously, we're all in shock and grief. No, all is not well at all, my dear darling wife, because your mother has just died and you loved your mother very much. So what are you talking about? I then went, sometime later and asked her, I said, what did you mean all was well at that moment? And she said, well, didn't you experience it too? And I went, what? And she went, well, I was in this place. It was infinite and connected. It was, I knew everything. Everything was good. It was love filled. And I'm thinking, this is my wife. We've been married for, at that point, maybe 25 years. I know her really well. She doesn't make stuff up. She's not super religious. I mean, she's quietly religious, but not to make pronouncements like this. So what is going on? And I decided to investigate that thing. And it turned out to be something called a shared death experience. And a shared death experience is a real thing. There's a phenomenon there. So that had tweaked my interest. I then I was so curious about it, I wrote a book about it, but it wasn't nonfiction, it was a fiction book, because I wasn't qualified to write it as nonfiction. What am I? I'm a nuts and bolts techie journalist. So that book came out in 2019. It was a thriller called The Grid, but it took consciousness as its substrate. But then it still hadn't scratched that itch of curiosity about what consciousness and reality are. So long story short, I was afforded the opportunity to bone up on consciousness for about 18 months during lockdown. Somebody actually funded me to do it, a philanthropist. So I became, from nothing, super knowledgeable about consciousness. I started to look into the nature of reality. I then wrote this essay that Robert Bigelow over at Bix had initiated to launch his Consciousness Institute. And that essay was on, the question was, provide the best evidence for the nature, provide the best evidence for proof of the reality of consciousness post-death. Prove what happens, that when we die, we continue. And I thought, I can answer that question. I've learned enough over the last 2 years to be able to answer that question. So I submitted the essay. To my surprise, I got a prize. Robert Bigelow then offered me a job on his Consciousness Institute as an advisor, which is what I still am. And I'm getting to answer your question finally, which was, so all of that told me perhaps that, a lot of us weren't looking at the question in the right way. For me, the question wasn't, why are these things intruding into our space? UFOs, whatever. It was, we haven't understood the space that these things are intruding upon. We don't understand the interface of our perception well enough to remotely understand what is going on with this phenomenon. So that is currently where I am. I am studying, if you like, that interface of our perception to better understand that, to give me clues then to the nature of the phenomenon, by which I mean UFOs, UAP, non-human intelligence, and related phenomena, to better understand them.
This makes me think of I'm going to try to condense this next question into 2 parts. The first part, I want to say I've read Leslie Kean's books as well. She mentions as well the connection between consciousness and the phenomena in her interviews and her books. I do not quite understand. To me, consciousness is an abstract, right? It's just this idea that doesn't have any physical substance to really tie to, but there are expressions of what you could call consciousness. You mentioned the experience with your wife and your mother-in-law. That is kind of a manifestation, or I guess an example of what consciousness represents, in a sense, like a part of it. Life after death, the idea of maybe abilities that people have, the experience of being aware of like being a conscious, aware individual, having an intellect. I do not understand that from the perspective of a practical perspective versus what it seems like is an abstract idea, consciousness. If you could make sense of that for me and the audience here, that would be great, because I've read so many things and I still don't get it. I don't understand. And then, of course, you mentioned about this idea of us not understanding this medium or interface. Why does it even? I don't even understand why that even matters to understand it. If something is happening that is outside of our control anyway, well, what are the implications for us, whether we understand it or not?
Okay, great questions. So deal with the first one first. Well, you are an extremely good company about consciousness, because no one understands it. I mean, actually, the only thing that anyone understands about it is the one that you mentioned, which is that it is awareness. It is the only thing we can bank on in this world is that we are aware, and that our awareness gives us our picture of the world. But is that the same picture of the world that you have? I don't know. No one knows. In fact, science, it was a big wake-up call for me when I realized, after all my concerns about, my credentials not allowing me to investigate consciousness, I then learned pretty quickly that science doesn't have a handle on what consciousness is either. It doesn't understand where it comes from. Right. There are many, many theories, of course, but they kind of boil down into two versions. One is that we produce consciousness through, electrochemical firings and reactions inside ourselves, in our brains. That's the materialist perspective. But then there is another perspective, which is that consciousness is pre-existent in the universe, in our reality, and that somehow we download it, much as a radio or a TV would, from like a signal. So in other words, our brains would act more like an antenna in receiving the signal. And that if you take the position, which actually science does, that the universe is primarily composed of information, then you could conceive of a universe filled with information that we download in some shape, way, or form. And along the way, this thing sparks us into conscious awareness. So, that's the first point. You're in great company. We're all in good company. No one understands what it is. But the position that mainstream science takes, which is that, our brains effectively generate consciousness, unfortunately for me, and increasingly for a lot of other people, doesn't take into account or explain what I consider to be outlier phenomena of consciousness. So UFOs, ghosts, cryptids, near-death experiences. Yeah, I mean, all of these things which are dismissed by mainstream science as junk, woo, voodoo, all the rest of it. For me and many other people, it's actually, no, that is too easy to do that. If no one else but me or you or a handful of people had these experiences, you could dismiss it in those terms. But the fact is, millions of people have these experiences. Millions of people see UFOs. By the way, I don't think I ever have, but still doesn't make me not believe in them, because the testimony of the people who report them actually is remarkably consistent across the board. And I'm someone who's trained to look at evidence. I might not have the scientific background, but I'm trained to look at evidence. And I go, this stuff is remarkably consistent across the board. So why is mainstream science dismissing it? My curiosity alone doesn't allow me to take that position. So let's put a sort of placeholder down for the moment on the consciousness question. Okay. And then go to the next one about what is the interface. So I don't know what the interface is either, but what I do know is that, even if we take the physical materialist position, that, about how I see, for example, that, my picture of the world is generated by light bouncing off an object I'm looking at. Right now, I'm looking at a tree out this window, and that through reflection and refraction, a picture generates upside down on my retina, which is then transposed by my brain's processing abilities into a coherent, visible picture. Fine. But that doesn't explain how the atoms of this table that I'm sitting at, which are 99.99999% empty space, why is this table solid? Why is it that, I bang the table and my hand reacts against it? Well, yeah, there's some electromagnetic reactive stuff going on between the atoms and the electrons in my hand, with the electrons and the atoms in the table. But that still doesn't explain what generates the solidity of my world. Right. Now, there is a great guy who really helped me formulate this this idea of the interface. He's a cognitive scientist in California called Donald Hoffman. He's at UC Irvine, and he formulated this sort of very good analogy of a computer screen. You know, I'm talking to you now through the interface of my computer screen. On that screen, there are various icons. You're an icon. You're an icon, Marquise. So everything on my screen comes to me through my interactions with an icon. But inside the guts of the machine, there's all sorts of stuff going on. Software, hardware programs, electricity running through it. I don't get to see those. In fact, I couldn't even begin to decipher them if I could see that stuff running around. But I do get to interface with those icons. And that, Hoffman says, is how reality is. We, through this magical conduit, medium of consciousness, we formulate an interface of perception about how we see the world. And that's how we deal with it. It's not the real world. Just as my computer is not really just composed of icons on my screen, it's got all kinds of things going on inside of it I never get to see or understand. Same with reality. There is behind this screen of perception all kinds of stuff going on at a subatomical level through energies and forces we don't see, much less understand. And that is really the sort of the guts of the machine, if you can call the universe a machine, we never get to see, that is building up behind this interface to give us this picture of reality. Now, if we don't understand that, and science doesn't, then how can it possibly understand the phenomena that appear upon that screen? And that's really where I am. And maybe we can take it from there.
That was, by the way, that was amazing. I've never thought of it the way that you just presented it. So thank you for that. That was awesome. Yeah.
You mentioned the numbers of people that have reported experiences, and like you said, if it was refined to a handful of people, you could say it's mental disorder or whatever, right? And in fact, John Mack looked at that. He thought, okay, well, maybe this is a new mental condition that hasn't been diagnosed. But upon doing his research and seeing similarities, even with children and everything else, he quickly ruled that out and agreed that there is in fact a phenomenon. Now, my question for you is, I sort of get stuck on, are these little gray men on craft coming trillions of light years across the universe to visit us, or are they somehow already here? Is there like a thin firmament that they can penetrate? Is it just our limited spectrum that we don't see them all around us? Like you said, we're creating our reality. We're taking quantum information and running it through a physical system. We're very limited. So are these things just here, and once in a while we can sort of interface with them? Or do you believe that they are actually beings from another part of the universe that have become advanced and have traveled back to see us?
May I add to that, just because I think this is a relevant addition to that question?
Sure.
There was a Reddit post earlier this year about an alleged microbiologist, I believe, who posted about studying a body, and these bodies that were essentially they were created organisms, essentially.
Yeah.
And Gary Nolan had essentially given credence to at least studying this microbiologist's post on Reddit, that the phenomena is not just these beings specifically in relation to the phenomena, may be created organisms, like artificially intelligent organisms that have a mix between different organisms native to this planet that something else is using to interface with us. So in addition to that question, I wanted to kind of add to that and see if maybe you could,
Well, okay. So, Louis, the short answer to your question is yes, and all of the above, I think. And the only reason I feel, one can say that is because, again, if we don't understand that interface of reality, anything that appears on that becomes possible.
Sure.
So, and its origins become possible. I started out like a lot of people thinking that extraterrestrial or non-human intelligence, I mean, actually, we've only recently sort of adopted that non-human intelligence term, but let's say extraterrestrial. Extraterrestrials if UFOs were real, then chances were they were extraterrestrials visiting this planet from other star systems. In fact, if you sort of read between the lines of a lot of investigation on Capitol Hill, there are still quite a few people who seem to hold that position still. That fundamentally we are looking at beings from other star systems coming here in exotic spacecraft that somehow managed to, bend space and time to get here, or travel at faster than light speed, which of course by our physics is impossible.
Yeah.
So already you're sort of putting up a bit of a sort of block between you and what this phenomenon could be. But actually, again, if you go back to this idea of an interface, and there being depths of reality behind this interface that we as humans never get to see, at least not customarily, then you can begin to conceive of other forms of non-human intelligence beyond the ones that come here in exotic interstellar spacecraft. So increasingly, I take the view that if we study this interface and if we go behind it, then we will become aware of forms of non-human intelligence that span a huge spectrum. And that spectrum could be from, literally on the sort of material end of non-human intelligence, there is animal intelligence from this planet. There's artificial intelligence from this planet. There are then literally interdimensional forms of non-human intelligence which may be penetrating through this interface occasionally to manifest as in physical form, or at least physical form as we understand it on this side of the interface. So I think there are all kinds of many different kinds of entities, if we can call them that, or non-human intelligence, that we are only now beginning to acknowledge, in that, again, me as a nuts and bolts, dyed-in-the-wool hack, as we call journalists this side of the pond. I come from that tradition where I want to see proof, but increasingly I'm hearing that term non-human intelligence used in governmental circles and in Pentagon circles on your side of the pond. So that gives me a little sort of, buffer of comfort that I'm not the only one. We aren't the only ones, thinking about this stuff and talking about it. On the question of, these created organisms, well, again, who knows? But why not? It's entirely possible, for example, that some of the entities that I think appear on this interface are either forms of artificial intelligence developed elsewhere, or they may be kind of avatars for real beings who could just use some physical form or shape, the shape of a body or a human or a quasi-human, to appear in our reality. Who knows? It could be any and all of the above. But to dismiss this stuff, from here on in, as just non-worthy of study is, in my opinion, all wrong. It's and it appears to be becoming increasingly prevalent. So does that mean that there are, the filters on this screen of perception that we're talking about, are they in some way, shape or form dissolving a little to allow more of this stuff to come through? Because it certainly seems that way to me and quite a few people I speak to. But again, one has to be careful because, just because I've started studying this phenomenon only relatively recently, does that mean that I'm just, suddenly becoming aware of all of these things as if they are becoming more prevalent? I don't know the answer to that, but there is certainly something. I think we all feel a little destabilized at the moment. There's so much weird stuff going on in the world, disturbing stuff like, we have two major conflicts in the world raging as we speak. That is very destabilizing. You could almost say it ripples out into reality as a destabilizing factor and force. So it may well be that this veil of perception that has served us very cogently for, many thousands of years is perhaps dissolving into something a little more fluid that is allowing some of these stranger outliers of consciousness, whether they be ghosts, cryptids, cryptozoological creatures, or UFOs, to appear in what we consider to be our reality. But like I say, I consider our reality, quotes, to be a very fluid and misunderstood thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Marquise.
Sorry, I'm going to try to focus here because I have like 4,000 questions based off that last thing you just said. So I'm just going to cut to the chase because I don't want to waste any time. Leslie Kean has mentioned that she has concerns about the phenomena. If when I look at the content that's been put out there by you, by George Knapp, and others about the phenomena, especially Skinwalker Ranch and so forth, there are two things that come to my mind. Two things. One, the phenomena isn't just passively appearing at random for no specific purpose. It seemed to be directly or intricately involved in human affairs, and has been for, if you believe in old religious texts, thousands of years. They've been gods, they've been demons, they've been angels, they've been everything. Fairies, allegedly throughout human history. They don't seem to be passive, or just a random anomaly. They seem to be, if in Jacques Vallée's words, I should be careful about this because he didn't, there's a control mechanism possibly being used to direct humanity towards some end. And when you mention about this interface, this filter being lessened or weakened or dissolving in whatever sense, that makes me wonder, what could that mean for us? Does that mean that the gods will come back? And I feel ridiculous for saying this, but does that mean the phenomena, whatever it may represent truly, will eventually be more explicit in not only its presence but its intention? And should that be a concern? Because even Leslie Kean says she's concerned about, in relation to the phenomena for humanity.
Well, I know Leslie quite well. She's she's a fantastically and deservedly so well-respected journalist. And we talk quite a bit. So anything that she brings up, in those question terms, is extremely valid. I don't know the answer to that, Marquise, and I wish I did. But what I do sense is that, again, and I can't believe sometimes I hear myself saying these things, given where I've come from. But, my sense is that, we've become so materialist as humans. We have put our faith in technology and our trust in technology. We have left behind traditions of spiritual awareness, of spiritual care, both of ourselves and of other people. That I'm really tempted to say, and in fact, I will say that when we approach these questions, and particularly about questions surrounding cognition and how we perceive things on this interface, I think we need to approach this interface with great reverence, with a sort of a reverence that our forebears came to approach their reality in. We know from civilization, the dawn of civilization, that gods were important to these people, our ancestors, and continue to be for hundreds, if not thousands of years, until we all suddenly got very civilized in the 16th and 17th centuries. And we decided that separation of mind and body, a la René Descartes, was a really good thing. Descartes said, no, we need to split out the spiritual side of us and the our devotion to same from the physical side of us. And that almost gave birth really to a sort of church and state enterprise where the church would take care of religion and the state would take care of everything else, including science. And these two things became very separate. I think that as we reintegrate consciousness into the equation of all of this, we need to bring back some of that respect and reverence for the things that we don't know about and we don't understand. And actually, if we do that, we might restore some balance in the world. As we discussed earlier, it really feels at the moment like the world has somehow tilted off its axis. We've got all of this chaos going on. And some of that, in fact, a lot of that needs to be restored. And more than that, if we're going to progress as a civilization, as humanity in the third decade of the third millennium going forward, we've got to, rethink a whole lot of things where our mind, a whole lot of areas in which our mindset has become stuck, and actually armed conflict is one of them. Is this really how we should be settling disputes at this time, through fighting guns, weaponry, and all the rest of it? Well, I think as we approach science and awareness in a new light going forward, all of these things come back onto the table. And as we approach this interface of perception and endeavor to learn and discover what it is, then I think we should do that with a certain amount of reverence or respect, perhaps is a better word. So, sometimes when these phenomena appear, I don't know, but, I sometimes think that there's a reflective quality to it. If you're poking the phenomenon, it's probably going to poke you back, or it might do. So, it gets back again, Louis, to your question about what are we seeing? Are these entities from other star systems, or are they already here? And again, I would answer that with, I don't know, but I think somehow it's all of the above.
Yeah, very well said. And with that, we're at the halfway point of today's show. So we're going to take our 5-minute break, and we'll see everybody back here in just a few on Quantum Ladder Podcast. And we are back with the second half of Quantum Ladder Podcast. Joining us today is the brilliant Nick Cook. And thanks again, Nick, for doing this. We really appreciate it. The first 50 minutes just flew by.
Yeah.
And we know we have probably about another 40 minutes to go here. So we'll keep it concise and to the point. So we were chatting about, various ideas on the phenomenon, what it could be. We're all humble enough to say we don't know, which I think is the right answer. Anybody out there saying it's definitely this or definitely not this, or they're all friendly or they're not. I mean, we don't know. So we have to be humble in the way we approach these type of questions. But I want to ask you, you've done a lot of work with people in the Pentagon and you write about top secret programs and things like that. What about the disinformation or misinformation, depending on what side of the fence you're on? I mean, if you take the government's word for it, there was nothing happened at Roswell. They looked into it briefly, and then nothing after 1969. And then you come to learn that really that research never ended, even into the days of like NIDS with Bigelow, and then OSAP, ATIP, now Arrow. So give us your insights on sort of the government's stand on this. Have they been just sort of keeping it quiet for our own good, or because they don't know? Has it been deliberate? What do you think?
Good question again, and my short answer to your question is yes, all of the above.
Yeah.
But okay, let's dive into that a little bit. Now, I need to qualify this with, I haven't actively reported on this world for 15 years, okay? I maintain a weather eye on it, so it's of interest. However, I can answer it from the position of where I was as a defense editor for nigh on 20 years. I mean, 15 or so years. So I was the aerospace editor of a magazine called Jane's Defense Weekly, premier sort of defense magazine based in the UK, global reporting mandate. One of the biggest stories that I covered during the late 80s and early 90s was stealth, the emergence of stealth as a technology. Stealth was a breakthrough technology and was hushed up for years, but actually resulted in an aeroplane, the stealth fighter, going into squadron service for 5 years unacknowledged, which is extraordinary. These things were flying around in the desert in Nevada and elsewhere, and they weren't meant to exist. So we were aware as reporters and editors of a very subtle sort of disinformation campaign to negate the existence of these aircraft. And over time, as the 1990s sort of drifted on, I became aware of further obfuscation and active disinformation. And that was when the CIA, amongst others, came out and admitted that during the 50s and 60s, it had used UFOs as a smokescreen for what it was doing back then with high-flying spy planes like the U-2 and the Blackbird and stuff. So we have precedent for this, and admitted precedent from the DoD and others and intelligence agencies that UFOs have been used as a smokescreen of disinformation for high technology secret programs. So it is no stretch to imagine that that same thing is going on today, but it just morphs into a different form. So, for example, whistleblower David Grush appears before Congress. He makes certain statements about, the phenomenon. I don't know whether they're all true or not, but people tell me reliably that, he's a stand-up guy. And in fact, most of the testimony you see would seem to support that. This guy has nothing to gain, pretty much, and everything to lose from the statements he has made. And yet he has made them under oath before Congress and de facto to the world. What you then sort of have started to see, I think, is a bit of a, what I call a sort of walk back campaign by officialdom to go, okay, so we started to sort of loosen the bottle top on this whole disclosure thing. We released some pressure by making certain admissions about the phenomenon, to wit, in 2021, I'm sure you both remember the Pentagon and the intelligence community issued a joint report about the phenomenon. It was the first time that they'd actually officially admitted that UFOs were real, and that means as a real phenomenon. They didn't say what they thought they were, but they said that this is a real thing. And that was the sort of first, or one of the first sort of releases of that disclosure pressure. But it seems as if, particularly with rampant activity on Capitol Hill and elsewhere in the last few years, certainly, that someone somewhere, or perhaps institution somewhere, have decided that all of this is going a little too fast for their liking, and they need to put a little, they need to turn the screw on the bottle top and put that pressure back into the bottle, because enough disclosure has come out for the time being. And you get that sort of sense of a walk back, not just in the media, and there is some of that, although actually I'm enormously impressed that increasingly the media, the mainstream media, is taking a much more open view than it certainly did in the past on the nature of this phenomenon and this question. But even so, you can still see pockets where this walk back campaign is happening. And as a former journalist, I mean, I was embedded in a press corps here in the UK, which was attached to the Ministry of Defence. So there were a group of us. I don't know, there was maybe 20 or 30 members of that corps, and you were fed official information, and that official information becomes your bread and butter. Your credibility stands or falls depending on whether you are able to access those sources, official sources of information. And if that official source of information is cut off for any reason, your editor is going to turn around to you and go, well, you're not much use to me anymore, Cook.
Yeah.
So, sling your hook and we're going to get somebody else in. All of that must be going through the minds of people who report this stuff. It is not easy to report it. I get it. I came from that tradition. I think there is a lot of disinformation that's flowing around. It is subtle. Some of it is very insidious. Some of it is very active, but it's there. And by the way, I think it is all feeding into this sort of reality matrix that we've been talking about. It's making that interface on which we perceive reality really squirrely. And it's not even sometimes about active disinformation. I mean, the mere fact that you can get so much fake news on in social media, that is also, queering the patch in terms of, what is real and what is fake. So it is becoming increasingly hard, whatever you're looking at, whether you're looking at UFOs or just ordinary news, to determine what is real and what is fake. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, people ask me occasionally, what do you do? Who do you trust? What sources of information do you trust? And I think the only thing that I could respond, I do respond by saying is, and this is me as a former journalist, don't trust any single source of information. You have to go out there, get curious, and find out yourself, and make value judgments on what you think is going on based on what you discover. But I'm tempted to go like Fox Mulder in the X-Files. Trust no one. No. Yeah. Trust people, but learn to trust your sources of information, and then decide for yourself.
Yeah. What about the quick idea here? Just real quick, Marquise, that the phenomena is preventing disclosure. Many people are saying the reason we're not getting the truth is they're infiltrated, and they're the ones that are preventing this. Or, when it does trickle out, it is at their discretion. They're in charge. This is their big plan. What do you think on, that type of idea?
Well, of course, I'm gonna caveat this with I have no idea,
Of course.
but I'm very taken with, and have long been taken with, Jacques Vallée's thesis of a control system, of a there being entities, whether those are, you could call them individual entities, non-human intelligences, or maybe even an overarching intelligence that is manifest in our reality, that is controlling in some way, shape, or form how we perceive our reality. That is certainly a possibility. I don't know whether the phenomenon intervenes, but occasionally I see things, or I glimpse things that make me wonder if it is. And to give you an example, beginning of the year, we'd had certain levels of disclosure going on in Capitol Hill, certain blocking maneuvers that had been going on in the ways that we've been talking about. And then, lo and behold, what happens? The Chinese send a balloon across the country, inadvertently. They didn't mean to, but it just happened. And we go, sorry, you guys, I'm quarter American, by the way, so I often think of myself as American. We go and shoot down the balloon, the Chinese balloon. It's a genuine Chinese spy balloon. And that, we think, is the end of the matter. But over subsequent days, 3 more objects shot down, and those objects have not been accounted for. There are various statements that have been put out to say, they were enthusiasts, balloons used for taking, weather measurements, and with radio beacons on them. Really? You shoot them down with an F-22 and an AIM-9X missile?
$500,000 missile.
Yeah.
Right. So, and in the meantime, you can't really account for the wreckage and any of that stuff. I've covered the sophistication of the US Armed Forces for a very long time. And that, for me, stretches the bounds of plausibility a long way. Yeah. So I then tease myself with the notion that this may be the phenomenon playing with us. And if you accept this Donald Hoffman view that our reality is just icons on a screen, anything becomes possible on that screen. What we consider real, solid objects, they're just those icons on a screen. So the balloon, the Chinese balloon, was obviously, quotes, real. The other things, well, they sort of mimicked the balloon, but I think there's more to them than meets the eye. So was this the phenomenon saying, you think you're clever? Collectively, US government or the US security infrastructure, you think you're very clever, you think you can shut this discussion down, but we're going to make it a little more complicated for you. We're going to manifest a phenomenon not unlike the Chinese balloon, but mysterious, and we're going to leave that as sort of pieces of jigsaw and pieces of evidence that people can go figure out at a later date. By the way, no one has yet, but as far as I can make out, certainly the mainstream media hasn't.
No.
If I were a journalist still, I'd be really tempted to want to go and follow that story to source, but it hasn't really been. So, I think there's all kinds of interference that goes on. And I think that we can say that with some increase in confidence based on, again, this, this idea of this interface and how little we understand this interface of perception. So, I think the world's getting weird, and it's getting weirder by the day. So, God knows what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
That's why we're here.
That's how exactly. I'm gonna I'm gonna go there, okay? Because you said a couple things that they're gonna make me. You kind of force me into this position that I'm in right now, and so entertain me, speculate. I have been following this for a couple of years. I'm not an OG like a lot of people are with the UFO topic. I have had experiences. I don't like to talk about it because I feel like it's irrelevant personally to my investigation. But I listened to Elizondo, for example, mention in an interview where he said that the government or the Department of Defense may be keeping this information suppressed for the good of the public. And what he expressed was that there could be an action predicated because of telling people the phenomena may have been planning something. And because people are aware of the phenomena globally, and the consciousness is there, the awareness is there, they may not wait potentially 50 or plus years or so to do something. They may do something tomorrow, and we don't have any kind of preparation for or even understanding of what the heck this is. And so whatever they want to do, whether it be good or bad for us, we're going to be subject to their whim entirely. I've also listened to Grush mention the fact that the idea that there have been deals made. Let's just go here, okay? I'm gonna speculate with me that there have been deals made with non-human intelligences and the government or the military or some element of that conjunction there. The idea that Pio Lavenda talks about, sinister forces, the idea that there is a phenomena that is literally infiltrated elements of the U.S. government and everywhere in human civilization to manipulate us for their own aims in not so pleasant ways. All of these things, all of these people have really, and I'm like you, I take the Jacques Vallée perspective, but I've also listened to, I've really been influenced by Peter Lavenda, heavily by Elizondo. 2017 is when I got involved in looking at this. And I am personally, I'm not, and the biggest reason why we left the UFO field is because of the vitriol, the toxicity. I do not think the phenomena is a pleasant thing. Doesn't mean they're going to come wipe us out or that's going to kill us all or whatever. I don't see it being a pleasant thing for humanity, even if to protect itself from us, because we seem to be a terribly violent species. I don't see the phenomena, the veil being thinning, or the veil thinning being a good thing. I don't see us, even if George Knapp mentioned that it might not be a good thing to tell the public about the whole truth. I am siding more on that kind of thinking than tell everyone, find out what's going on, and let everybody know, hey, this is what it is, because maybe something bad will happen as a consequence of us becoming fully aware of the phenomena.
Well, a lot to unpack there for sure. Again, I come from that aerospace and defense background. So there is a great part of me, or at least a part of me, that gets Lou Elizondo's position, which is, we don't know what this is. Well, at least I think this is his position. We don't know what this is, so we need to exercise caution. And he and others, rightly from the position of a threat analyst, are looking on this in threat analytical terms, where you gauge primarily two things, capability and intent. Capability is clearly there. We know the capability of some of these craft is phenomenal. Not only can they move with extraordinary speed, they have stealth capabilities. They appear to be able to shut down offensive and defensive missile systems with impunity. That's capability. Then there's the other half, or the other part of the equation, which is intent. We don't really know the intent. So if I were a threat analyst, it would be my job to exercise due caution and err on the side of playing it safe, which is, these things may be a threat. So we need to treat them for the moment as one, potentially. I do think, though, and we may have touched on this earlier, that there is an element of what you bring to the interface, it is going to reflect back at you. There is that expression, I can't remember, is it Nietzsche's, which is If you stare into the abyss will stare back at you.
Yeah.
So there may be an element of that here, and certainly there is anecdotal evidence that nasty things can and occasionally do happen to people from this phenomenon. But I also think that maybe we should take the phenomenon's position for a moment and go, I think you mentioned it, Marquise. You come here, or maybe you already live here. I mean, in that you are existing alongside us in some dimensional reality, and you see what we are doing to each other, and you go, these people don't give a shit about themselves, so why should we? And I think there is no single answer in any of this. You brought up the names of two people who are immensely respected in this field, in Elizondo and Lavender, and I wouldn't take positions against either of them. I think they speak a great deal of sense. Of course, they've been looking at this phenomenon for a very, very long time. But I tend to be a bit more hopeful in my prognostications. I believe that we can't. We're not wholly in charge of this. We may not even be in charge of any of it. So to deny it by going, you can't tell people, because actually that's just going to make things all the more destabilizing. I get why governments would do that. I get why intelligence agencies and defense ministries and departments would do that. But as we've already noted, there may be a part of this thing which is driving disclosure itself. And every time we try and shut it down by, closing the lid of that bottle and, trapping the pressure buildup inside, it just finds another way of coming out. And that might just be what we're dealing with here. This is consciousness somehow acting on us through itself, through this interface, shifting reality to make us what? We don't know. More aware, more self-aware, more caring. Does the phenomenon care about us? We don't know the answers to this question or any of these questions, but my intuition, my gut is telling me that we cannot approach this field, this phenomenon, using the tools of investigation that we've used in the past, and using the mindsets that we have used for 400 years more. That dualistic mindset of there's mind and there's body, there's church, there's state, there's spirituality and science. No, we've got to fundamentally reframe, I think, how we see ourselves, how we see the world, and how we see things beyond the screen of our perception or the world of our perception, to be curious about what might lie out there, be out there, but cautiously curious. And as I said earlier, my instinct is we need to approach this with some respect and reverence. And that doesn't sound very scientific, and scientists aren't going to like it. But that's not to say we shouldn't use the tools of science on it. It's just that we can't just use the tools of science alone. We need to, I think, be more caring and nurturing of ourselves and of our planet before we tackle these huge questions simply through the lens of science and technology alone.
I do want to be clear, Elizondo. I don't want to misrepresent. He said that is the position of the DoD. Like you just mentioned, they're cautious because that's the nature of the DoD, the Department of Defense. Its nature is to defend. He said that is their position. He doesn't agree. He does believe we should know because I think, somewhat in conjunction with what you said, he thinks that by us knowing it could help us. So I just want to be clear. Like, disclosure is a good thing in his mind, and he wants to push for disclosure, which is why I've always respected him from the beginning.
Sure. Yeah, me too. No, absolutely. He is merely stating the official position. Yeah.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, because again, you're a techie guy, material science guy. When I, got into this, I thought, well, okay, is there any physical evidence, something that like the public could have access to, or are there artifacts roaming around out there? And I was fortunate enough to interview Gary Nolan about a year and a half ago. This was before his SALT conference where he basically let it all out.
Yeah.
But I had asked him, I said, hey, I've heard that there's these things called arts parts from the Art Bell show, little bits, fragments of UFO that have a weird crystalline nature. They're like, nano layers of bismuth and magnesium.
No.
There's no apparent reason why you would make this stuff. The cost would be astronomical. And as I'm talking to him, he disappears off camera. So I'm still kind of formulating my question. And then I finally got to a point where I didn't have anything else to say. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, are you grabbing something? What? This is the middle of a show. And he pulls it up and he's like, yeah, you're talking about this stuff right here. And I couldn't believe he had a physical remnant of that with him. And so I asked him and he kind of gave me an aloof answer. I said, is this piece of a UFO? And so then I gave him the out and I said, okay, I know you can't say because of your position, but have you been told, or do you believe that we, the government, somebody is in possession of exotic material that did not originate on planet Earth? And he just looked at us and said, yes. And that was just like, jump out of your seat, because this guy just acknowledged that that's a friggin' piece of a UFO. And the amazing thing to me is sort of, the things Bob Lazar talked about, the propulsion. You look at the characteristics, UAP display, turning on a dime, even Elizondo with the 5 observables, no propulsion, no heat, no flaps or control surfaces, instantaneous propulsion,
hypersonic velocity.
Hypersonic, like over 3,000 miles an hour, no problem.
10,000 sometimes.
Yeah, and then when you get somebody like Gary Nolan talking about this structure, and then I talk to other people who are into metamaterials and, metallurgists and stuff like that, and they basically say, yeah, it could, in theory, produce a waveform, and maybe that's how these things manipulate, our space and don't really behave with the same laws of physics. That's why they don't need all these things that we do. So what are your thoughts on actual artifacts that may exist and metamaterials more specifically?
Yeah, I got to add to that because I think this is. I watched a documentary, James Fox's documentary, where Jacques Vallée and Gary Nolan were together working on the metamaterial. And the one thing they mentioned that, again, I'm not a scientist. I just, as a layperson, when I hear this, it makes me think it's obviously not us. That the metamaterial, it had isotopic ratios that were just bizarre.
Not from this planet.
Not from this solar system, from what I understand. They said it's not even from the solar system. And that also... that it was made outside of our of planet Earth, and that Gary Nolan made a comment. I'm going to try to rephrase this. We make the world out of 80 elements. Somebody's making the world out of 250 plus isotopes. Yeah. What are the implications of that?
Well, so coming from my tech nuts and bolts, tradition, there's nothing like a bit of technology to sort of, ground you. I remember, I think shortly after the New York Times 2017 story came out, I was visiting the laboratory of Hal Puthoff, Dr. Hal Puthoff, who, I'm sure you guys know, he's often, lauded, rightly so, I think, as, one of the foremost experts on kind of exotic technology and propulsion technology and so forth. So I was in his laboratory and he showed me a piece of stuff and he said, this is purported to be a metamaterial from something. We don't know what it is, but it's composed of, and subsequently I think it found its way to TTSA, to the Stars Academy and Tom DeLonge's outfit. So, maybe I was gazing upon an artifact from an exotic craft of some description. Now, expand that out. Do I think that there is technology in basements of companies and laboratories scattered around the country. In fact, and not just in the US, but in other parts of the world that may be, either off planet or exotic to the degree that they don't come from some terrestrial, human program. Well, for years, I thought that was impossible. I wrote this book, The Hunt for Zero Point, which was sort of looking at the flip of that question, which was, could we humans have developed technology that is so exotic that it would perform like a UFO? I don't want to spoil the end of that book because it is written a bit like a thriller deliberately. But, I get to the end of that having learned a lot of things, but the one thing I did not have was smoking gun evidence that we had created that breakthrough. Over the years, and quite recently, I've sort of refined my own view on that, which is that I think it is highly likely that we have recovered non-human, intelligently derived artifacts of craft, that they may either be parts or complete craft. One hears the lore that they do involve complete craft. I find it harder and harder to just reject that evidence, or rather that testimony, increasingly hard. And part of that is based on my sort of knowledge of how that world works, or at least, certainly how the parts of it work that developed highly classified aircraft technology. It is not too much of a stretch for me to imagine that, several layers down, further down from the most secret aircraft you can imagine, there is tech being worked on that is, truly exotic. And so that's sort of where I am now. Yeah, I have not closed my mind to that possibility. In fact, I'd be surprised now if we haven't recovered those craft or bits of them and are trying to exploit them. And again, I wouldn't be the first person to say this. I know Gary Nolan has himself, which is, how insane is it, when, okay, I get the part about this conferring military value and technological value. We are in an arms race, sadly, with Russia and China, wherein they too undoubtedly are trying to acquire this same technology, if they haven't already, and I suspect it's highly likely that both of them have. So, on the one hand, it's crazy that in, again, the third decade of the third millennium, we are covering this stuff up, even though it may have qualities in it that could, quote, save the planet. If there is a propulsion or energy breakthrough associated with it. But at the same time, of course, that other half of me recognizes that that same technology, given a bit of tweaking, becomes the most potent weaponry you can conceive of. And we are in an arms race. I get that. But we've got to find a way around this. And I think Gary and certainly others have, said it is not going to come through looking at this through a stovepipe of military thinking. It is going to, the breakthroughs and the exploitation breakthroughs are going to come from an enlightened whole of science approach, where not just the military or the intelligence community is, holding this stuff very close held and going, we've got to hang on to this and analyze it ourselves. And you hear anecdotally that associated with that, they are stymied. They cannot figure out how it works. Well, if there is a consciousness derived aspect of in other words, putting a human, or no, rather an intelligence in the loop to try and make this stuff work, which it might do, then it's never going to work. Again, it's a bit like, we were talking about how you approach the interface. If you approach the interface of cognition and perception, and you prod it with a view to prodding the phenomenon is going to prod you back. If you approach this technology with a view of, I'm going to keep it close held, I'm going to look on it as a weapon, maybe it's not going to give up its secrets. So, I think that's what we're dealing with. It's double-edged, but we've got to find a way around it if we are going to survive, in my opinion, as a species going forward.
Final thought to you, Marquise, before we ask Nick about where people can find him. You got any last questions, brother? I know we got 1,000, but we're limited on time.
If I do that, I don't want to. I know that if I ask any more questions, it could extend. I don't want to do that to you. I want to respect your time. So I just want to thank you. This is awesome. I do hope that we get another chance to talk to you, because I definitely have more questions just to get your mind, your thoughts on things and get your perspective on them. But I really appreciate your perspective, specifically when you mentioned at the very beginning, you gave an analogy of how consciousness, or why that interface is important. That changes my perspective. I didn't even think about this idea of an interface. And not only that, but when you relate it to technology, the computer interface, that resonates with me because I'm a very techie guy. That really changed my perspective. I appreciate that. So that's all I want to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. I mean, I've really enjoyed the conversation. And it's interesting, Marquise, you pick up about the interface thing, because again, I'm not a scientist, so I have to work with metaphors. I have to work from metaphors that enable me to understand, or help me to understand, things that are fundamentally not understandable. And consciousness is not understandable. Reality as well, the nature of reality, is really hard to penetrate, and ultimately may be non-understandable as well. So these metaphors for me, like Donald Hoffman's interface, become really important. There is another one. It's not dissimilar, but it's a slightly different take on Donald Hoffman's, which comes from another guy I respect greatly, called Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo is a philosopher, and he's also a computer scientist. His analogy is sort of similar, but we experience reality much as a pilot or a flight crew on an aircraft experiences the environment outside of the aircraft through the instrument panel of the plane. So you can imagine, if you're flying through the night, you rely on your instruments for the instruments to tell you what is going on outside the aircraft. You're not directly interfacing with the weather systems, with the atmospheric conditions, the wind conditions outside the aircraft. You're interfacing with the instruments. And that, he says, is analogous to how we interpret reality. We are gaining a picture of our reality, a very filtered view, through these instruments, because if we got the whole picture, it would blow our minds. Because there's so much reality out there that it would literally just blow our minds. So evolution has given us this filtering that gives us all the reality we need, and no more. Because if we experienced nature, the nature of reality in all its fullness, we would just, it would so freak us out. We would never be able to function. So I like those two analogies. There's Donald Hoffman's, which is the computer screen. There's Bernardo Kastrup's, which is the aircraft instrumentation panel. And I think for me, they both work really effectively to describe how we as humanity interface with reality.
I got a comment. One more comment on that. So I was thinking when you said that maybe insanity is a consequence of the veil disseminating and of course the true nature of reality being fully realized. Maybe the insane people know the truth, and
brain can't handle it.
Well, I am sure that we will learn things about ourselves going forward, in which perhaps some, previously diagnosed mental illnesses will be deemed not to have been mental illnesses at all, but just a broader perception of reality, for sure.
Yeah. Well said. And Nick, where can people learn more about you, your work, your books?
Well, I've got a website which is nickcook.works. I've got I'm on Twitter occasionally. I'm not I'm trying to do a little bit more on X. That's at I am Nick Cook. My books are out there. The Hunt for Zero Point is available, through all good bookstores and online outlets. So yeah, just I'm around.
Awesome. And we really appreciate your time today. We know we got to let you go. We'd love to do a part 2 someday if you have some time. I know you've been busy recently with Ross Coulthard and other shows. So thank you for taking the time to come on our show. You're always a welcome friend here. And if everybody has enjoyed this episode, give us a thumbs up. If you haven't yet subscribed to our channels, please do so. We are on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and the UnX network as well. And with that, we'll bring today's show to a close. I want to thank our distinguished guest, Mr. Nick Cook. And on behalf of Marquise Williams and myself, Louis Borges, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we'll see you next week.